I still remember the exact moment the wine glass stopped moving. My boyfriend's father had been mid-pour, tilting the bottle over his wife's glass, and then he just paused. His eyes had landed on me across the table, and something shifted in his expression. Not rude, not unkind, just the particular kind of assessment that older men sometimes do when they're trying to figure out where exactly you fit. I smiled. He finished pouring. The moment passed, but I felt it. His name was Robert, and he was 63 years old, and for 31 of those years, he had been one of the most respected corporate litigators in Ontario. He had argued cases before the Court of Appeal. He had a plaque in his study. I caught a glimpse of it when I passed the hallway looking for the bathroom, from the Law Society of Ontario, something about distinguished service. He had built his career from our tickling student to named partner through what my boyfriend, James, described as a combination of genius and stubbornness that nobody could outwork. James had told me all of this in the car, not to intimidate me. More like he was giving me context, the way you'd brief someone before walking into a situation that had its own weather. He's not going to be difficult, James said, merging onto the 401 westbound. It was a Saturday in late October, and the trees along the highway were doing that last dramatic thing before winter, all copper and dark red. He has opinions about everything, and he likes to share them. I work with people who have opinions, I said. Not like his. I had been with James for almost 3 years. We met at a mutual friend's going-away party in Kensington Market, standing by the same overloaded snack table, both of us pretending to read the labels on things neither of us intended to eat. He was funny in a dry, quiet way that took me a few weeks to fully appreciate. He worked in urban planning for the city of Toronto, and he cared deeply about things like transit infrastructure and green space allocation in a way that made him genuinely interesting to talk to at 11 o'clock at night, when everyone else had run out of things to say. We had been living together since January. His parents lived in Burlington, 45 minutes west, depending on traffic, and the reason it had taken this long to have an actual sit-down dinner with them was, honestly, a combination of schedule and circumstance that I will not pretend was entirely coincidental. His mother, Patricia, had been dealing with a health situation through most of last year. Nothing critical, but enough to limit big family gatherings. His father had been in the middle of a major case that consumed him entirely for 8 months. And then James and I had taken a week in Portugal in the spring, and the fall had arrived faster than anyone expected. So here we were. October, first real dinner. Patricia had made a lamb roast with roasted root vegetables and a wild rice pilaf that smelled incredible from the front hallway. She was warm in the way that some people are genuinely warm, not performatively, just actually glad to see you and not bothering to hide it. She hugged me before I'd fully gotten my coat off and said she'd heard so many good things and she hoped I liked lamb. I liked lamb very much. Robert shook my hand. Firm. Eye contact, the practiced greeting of someone who had spent decades reading people in the first 30 seconds and had gotten very good at it. He said it was lovely to finally meet me, and I believe he meant it, and I also believe that the assessment was already underway. We sat down. Patricia brought out wine. Robert opened a second bottle he'd been saving, something from a small Niagara winery he'd discovered the previous summer, and he talked about it with the kind of quiet authority he seemed to bring to most subjects. "What do you do, Serena?" he asked, once the glasses were filled and the serving dishes were making their way around the table. "I'm a lawyer," I said. Something in his posture shifted slightly. A subtle thing. A kind of interested repositioning. "What area?" "Corporate. Primarily M&A. Some securities work." "Bay Street?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're updating their mental file on you. I could see him recalibrating. "Which firm?" I told him. He knew it, of course. Anyone who'd spent 3 decades in Ontario law would know it. It was a name that carried its own particular weight in that world. "Good firm," he said. "I appeared opposite one of their senior partners once, years ago. Whitmore, I think his name was. Sharp. Old school, but sharp." "He retired a few years back," I said. "I knew him a little." "Did you?" Not quite a question, more like a small acknowledgement. We talked about other things for a while. Patricia asked about our apartment, about Portugal, about James's project with the city's waterfront development plan. Robert asked James some pointed questions about municipal budget cycles that turned into a 5-minute back and forth about infrastructure funding formulas, and I listened and ate the lamb, which was extraordinary. Then Robert refilled his wine glass, leaned back slightly in his chair, and turned toward me again. The M&A space has changed so much, he said. The regulatory environment has become genuinely complicated, especially post-pandemic, with the competition bureaus stepping up review on anything that looks even slightly horizontal. He said this in the tone of someone explaining something to a person who might not quite understand it. It has, I agreed. A lot of younger lawyers get caught off guard by the merger review timelines, the SIR process especially. People underestimate how much the Bureau has evolved its approach to market definition. I looked at him. They really have, I said. We spent the better part of last spring on a file where the Bureau expanded their market definition in a direction that frankly surprised even some of the more experienced people on the file. What sector? He asked, and now his tone had shifted. Slightly. He was still the one leading, but there was a crack of genuine curiosity in it. Logistics and supply chain. Cross-border. The U.S. Nexus added a layer because we were coordinating with HSR filing timelines simultaneously. A pause. HSR and Competition Act concurrently? Yes. The deal had significant U.S. revenues, so both triggers applied. It was a scheduling puzzle more than anything else. Robert looked at me for a moment in a way that was different from before. Not quite reassessing. More like he was listening now rather than simply waiting to speak. But then he picked up a different thread. I'll be honest with you, he said, and in my experience, when people say that, they have already decided what they're going to say, and the honesty disclaimer is load-bearing. When I was practicing, we had a clear sense of what M&A files required. Experience. Pattern recognition. You need to have seen enough deals go sideways to know which ones are going sideways before the client realizes. That takes time. He looked at me with a kind of genial authority. It's not something you can accelerate. No, I said. You can't. The firms are pushing people faster than they used to. Junior associates running point on things they're not quite ready for. He picked up his fork. It's a pressure thing. The economics of the model demand it now. I took a sip of wine. Patricia was looking at the serving dish near her elbow with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to say something or let a moment pass. James said, "Dad." "I'm not being critical," Robert said. "I'm speaking generally. You're speaking directly at Serena. I'm making conversation." The table was quiet for a second, the particular quiet of a room where several things are true at once. I said, "It's a fair observation." Robert looked at me. "The pressure has increased," I said. "The timelines are shorter, the client expectations are higher, and yes, there are associates on files earlier in their careers than there used to be. That's real." I set down my glass. What's also real is that some of us managed to develop the pattern recognition a little faster than the traditional timeline assumed was possible. He tilted his head slightly. "That's confidence." "It's not confidence," I said. "It's a description." Patricia made a small sound that might have been a laugh, very quiet, immediately suppressed. Robert said, "How long have you been at the firm?" 8 years. "And your call year?" I told him. He did the math quickly, I could see it, and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, but the genial authority reconfigured itself into something that looked more like actual attention. "So you came up through the 2016 cohort," he said. 2017, technically. I articled the year before. "And you're doing Competition Act concurrent with HSR. Among other things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's your title at the firm?" I had been waiting for this, not because I planned to deploy it like a weapon, but because I knew it was coming and I had decided some time ago that I would answer it exactly as I would answer any other question. Simply and directly. "Partner," I said. "I was made partner 2 years ago. I co-lead the M&A group now." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had a different texture. Robert looked at me. His expression was not embarrassed exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who is rapidly reorganizing a set of assumptions they had not realized they were carrying. James, to his very significant credit, did not say anything. He refilled his water glass and looked at the middle distance with the focused calm of someone who had learned a long time ago when to let a room breathe. Patricia said, "More lamb?" I said, "Yes, thank you. I would love more lamb." Robert set down his fork. He picked it up again. He cut a piece of meat and ate it and looked at the table and then looked at me. "I didn't know that," he said. "James might have mentioned it," I said, "but it's easy to lose track of." "He mentioned you were in corporate law." "That's accurate." Another pause. Robert had the quality. And this, actually, I came to understand as the evening went on, was a quality worth respecting of not reaching for easy deflection. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't pivot immediately to a new subject. He sat with it for a moment, which is harder than it sounds. "I was speaking to you like someone who needed the overview," he said. "A bit." That was condescending. "A bit," I said again. He looked at me steadily. "I apologize. I had not expected it to be that clean. In my experience, both professional and otherwise, people who have said something that revealed an unexamined assumption tend to defend the assumption, or minimize it, or redirect toward some other grievance. Robert did none of those things. He just said he apologized, plainly, and meant it. "Thank you," I said, "and I meant that too." Patricia released a long breath and reached for the wine. James looked at his father and then at me and then at the lamb and said, "This is the best roast you've made in years, Mom." "I know," she said. After dinner, Robert asked if I wanted to see his study. It was phrased as an offer, not a requirement. He said he had some case materials from an old file that had a Competition Act dimension, and he'd be curious what I made of the regulatory strategy they'd taken. I said yes. The study was what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, civil procedure texts spine to spine with tax law volumes, a desk that looked like it had been used hard for many years. The plaque I'd glimpsed earlier was from 2008. On the corner of the desk, next to a yellow legal pad, was a framed photograph of James at what looked like a high school graduation, blinking into the sun, looking slightly annoyed at being photographed. Robert pulled out a binder from a lower shelf. He talked through the file, a proposed acquisition in the food distribution sector, late 1990s, back when merger review in Canada looked quite different. The regulatory landscape had been less developed. The Bureau's analytical framework had not yet incorporated some of the economic modeling that became standard later. I asked a few questions. He answered them. And then, and this is the part I keep thinking about, he asked me a few questions. Not the overview questions, the real ones. What did I make of how the Bureau had been approaching efficiencies, arguments lately? Did I think the recent amendments had actually changed the calculus or just the language? What was the practical effect of the new timelines on deal certainty for clients? We talked for maybe 40 minutes. At some point, Patricia appeared in the doorway and looked at us and disappeared again without saying anything. When we came back to the kitchen, James was doing the dishes. He looked up when we walked in, registered something in the room's atmosphere, and handed me a tea towel without comment. Robert poured himself a small amount of the Niagara wine he'd opened earlier. He looked at James and said, "You should have said more about what Serena does." James said, "I mentioned it. You said corporate law. I said M&A partner. I said it twice." Robert considered this. "I may not have been listening properly. You had a lot to say about the waterfront project." Robert made a small acknowledging sound. He looked at me. "Do you like Burlington?" "It's beautiful," I said. "Especially this time of year." "You should come for Christmas," he said. "If you'd like." I said I'd like that. On the drive back east on the 401, the city lights beginning to emerge through the dark, and the trees now just shapes against the sky, James drove with one hand on the wheel and said, "I'm sorry about dinner." "Don't be. He had a whole theory of you before you sat down." "Most people do." I said, "It usually revises. He liked you." "I know." James glanced at me sideways. "How do you know?" He asked real questions, I said. When someone shifts from telling to asking, that's the revision happening. James was quiet for a moment. We pass a transport truck. Its running lights orange in the dark. I did tell him, he said. Twice. M&A partner, I believe you. He wasn't listening. He was listening to his own expectations, I said. It's not malicious. It's just a habit some people have. You carry an idea of how something is going to go and you stop actually looking at what's in front of you. That's generous? He apologized cleanly. That's not nothing. James drove for a while. We crossed the Mississauga boundary, the road widening, the traffic thinning out toward downtown. He asked if you'd want to come back at Christmas, he said. He mentioned it. Does that mean you want to? Patricia's lamb was very good. He laughed quietly, and the sound of it filled the car in a way that made the October dark outside feel less cold. Here's what I've learned from that night and from the years of similar moments before it. The people who assume they already know what you are. They're not always wrong about everything. Robert was right that pattern recognition matters. He was right that experience is not something you can simply skip. He was right about a lot of things, actually, and his career and his reputation were built on substance, not pretension. He was just wrong about where I was in the sequence. And the thing that stays with me is not the moment of reveal, not the satisfying internal click of watching someone update their assumptions in real time. That part is quick. It's over fast. What stays with me is the 40 minutes in the study afterward. Two lawyers from different decades talking about regulatory evolution and deal structure with the equal footing ease of people who actually understand each other. That's the conversation I wanted to have from the beginning. It just took a slightly different route to get there. I went back for Christmas. We talked about the competition tribunal's recent jurisprudence over Patricia's roast turkey and Robert's second favorite Niagara Red. He listened. So did I. That made all the difference. The 40 minutes Robert and I spent in that study. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the moment his expression shifted when I said the word partner. Not the quiet that followed. Those things happened and they were real, but they passed quickly, the way most moments of revelation do. What stayed was what came after. Two people who had started the evening talking past each other, finding their way to an actual conversation. I think about why that was possible, and I keep arriving at the same answer. Robert, for all his assumptions that night, had the integrity to sit with being wrong. That's rarer than it sounds. It's easy to mistake confidence for character, to assume that someone who has built something real, a career, a reputation, 30 years of hard work, will also have the self-awareness to recognize when they've misjudged something. Those qualities don't always come together. In Robert's case, they did. He said he apologized, and he meant it, and then he moved forward rather than sideways. That kind of honesty with yourself. About what you assumed, about what you got wrong, about the gap between your expectations and what was actually in front of you. That's not a small thing. It's what allows a person to keep learning past the point where most people stop. Robert had built a distinguished career on the strength of his mind, but what made that evening end well wasn't his intellect. It was his willingness to use it honestly, even when it cost him something. And on my end, I think about what it took to stay steady through that dinner. Not to get up and leave, not to perform a dramatic reveal, not to let the low simmer of being underestimated pull me off course. I had worked a long time to get where I was. Not quickly, whatever it looked like from the outside. 8 years is 8 years, and none of them were easy. The late nights on files that almost fell apart. The moments of doubt that I kept mostly to myself. The slow, unglamorous accumulation of experience that eventually becomes the thing people call expertise from the outside, not understanding all the invisible work underneath it. That persistence, the quiet, stubborn kind that doesn't need an audience, is its own answer to every room that has underestimated you. You don't have to argue for it, you just have to keep going until it speaks for itself. What I didn't expect, going into that dinner, was to find someone worth talking to on the other side of the awkward part. But that's the thing about people who have actually done hard work over a long time. They usually have something real to say once the posturing settles. Robert knew things I didn't know. His decades in litigation had given him a perspective on the legal profession that my 8 years in M&A hadn't. I left that study with 2 or 3 thoughts I hadn't had before I walked in. That's what I want to remember about that night. Not the satisfaction of the reveal, which lasted maybe 30 seconds, but the conversation that came after, which I'm still thinking about months later. If you walk away from a moment of being underestimated only with the vindication, you've walked away with the smaller thing. The larger thing is what happens when 2 people decide after the awkward part to actually listen. James and I went back for Christmas. Patricia made turkey. Robert opened the second best Niagara Red he had. He said he was saving the best one for spring, and we argued respectfully about the competition tribunal for an hour before his wife told us both to leave the table and help with the dishes. We did.